Hi, everybody. I'm Derek Cartwright, and this is another installation of the series that we're calling Curator's Corner, where I'm trying to share with you some of the behind-the-scenes activities of the curatorial department of the Timken while we're closed to the public in this current health crisis. And so a couple of weeks ago, you may recall that I gave a short presentation about a painting that was in the Timken's vault, in which we had questions about its attribution and where it came from, and there was a lot of good response to that. So I thought I would follow up and talk again about attribution and the work of curatorial departments in determining possible authorship for paintings and collections. And the Timken has a small collection, as we've said before, but it also has a really interesting collection. Very few of the works in the Timken's holdings are not securely attributed. And there are a few, however, and I wanted to talk about a few of those today. So I'm going to share my screen with you as I usually do and walk you through a few images. So I just mentioned that there are a couple of paintings that we have questions about who made them, and they go as early as the 15th century in the Flemish Dutch galleries to the 17th century in this little Italian still life. And I think the painting I mentioned just recently is this little unknown work of the 19th century American work. So in effect, if you think about it, there are paintings potentially in each gallery of the Timken that don't have a securely attributed identification to them. And if you think about the Russian icons, most of which were never intended to be signed by an individual artist, there are actually quite a few paintings that scholars might puzzle over and think, who made this? The one that I'm most interested to talk with you about today is this one, which is currently hanging in the Dutch Flemish galleries, and which I like quite a bit, but has this anonymous label on it. We know quite a bit about the painting, but we just don't know who made it. We're sure that it was made by a Dutch or Flemish artist or someone quite familiar with those approaches to painting. I think it fits in nicely to the installation that we have, with hangs right next to Petrus Christus's Death of the Virgin. It's a good example of how Flemish painting techniques develop in the mid to late 15th centuries. And yet we don't really know who made this work, which wasn't always the case. And I guess that's one of the things that I wanted to share with you. We can say with great certainty, what the image is. We know it's the Adoration of the Magi, which for those of you who are familiar with biblical narratives, know is the moment when these three wise men, or maybe three kings, come to the site of Jesus's birth and pay tribute to him by bringing various gifts. And it doesn't take very long to look at the Timken's painting and understand how it fits into that iconography. So I'm just showing you details of the Timken's painting, as well as a early 16th century print by Lucas van Leyden, on which bears a kind of striking resemblance to the Timken's print. But based on certain common approaches to painting these subjects, we can very quickly identify Caspar, Balthazar, Melchior, Jesus, of course, and Mary and Joseph as key principal actors within this mini drama that's unfolding on this small panel painting. I think there's a lot more to it than that. And of course, the artists who made it and the initial patrons of this work certainly knew who made it, but we have lost track of its initial authorship. When the work was acquired by the Timken and it was purchased in 1955 by the Putnam Foundation for a future museum, it had an attribution given by Max Jakob Friedlander, who was a German art historian and really one of the great connoisseurs of the 20th century, who wrote this massive multi-volume study of Netherlandish art. And our painting appears in that. It appears in, I think, volume 6 of that publication, which originally was published in 1924 and was not translated into English until the 60s. But Friedlander felt sure that this was a painting by an artist who he called the master of the St. Lucy legend. And I want to speak a little bit about that. It was based on a kind of stylistic grouping of objects, all of whom seem to be by the same hand. And Friedlander recognized, and he would, a kind of familiarity between the way that the figures are painted in the Timken's panel and other images by this to us unknown master who went by the name of Master of the St. Lucy legend. That attribution actually held pretty steady, and Elizabeth and Agnes Mongan, who advised the Timken to buy the picture and who also remained advisors to the Timken and wrote for the early catalogs of the collection, felt very sure that Friedlander was right up until about 1983, and then some questions developed. And in fact, scholars began to say, well, Friedlander was never sure that this was by the Master of the St. Lucy legend. And by 1983, in a Timken publication, there was serious enough doubt that the painting shifted its attribution from being by the Master of the St. Lucy legend to just an anonymous 15th century Flemish painter. It's interesting to me because we actually have paintings, adorations of the Magi by the artist known as Master of the St. Lucy legend. This is, I'm showing you one that lives at the Cincinnati Art Museum. And you can see that there are good reasons for Friedlander's initial identification of this work by that hand. Just take a look at, although the Timken's painting is much smaller, this work by that artist in Cincinnati shares so much in terms of the general poses of the figures, the rough conformation of the landscape, even the shelter in which they're housed. All of that seems to be borrowed or at least taken. And I think Friedlander, looking quickly, might have just made the immediate identification on a hunch that these were by the same person. Although, if you look at a group of paintings by this artist, you quickly see problems with that attribution. And so I'm just showing you the Thyssen-Bornemisze's Pietà by this same unknown master. And I think an untrained eye sees how the painter who made this work is so much more interested in reflective surfaces, in the quality of that brocaded fabric, in the kind of sense of atmosphere that bathes the landscape behind. All those things are fundamentally different, even if there are some stylistic shared qualities between these two works. I think that the close or certain identification of this painting being by the same artist as did the Timkens begins to fall apart. And I think that's why the Mongans lost their confidence in that attribution, and why I also share some of their loss of confidence, although I have to say I don't have a better attribution to offer you today. Going back to the 15th century and looking at other examples of this particular subject matter, this particular iconography, I think we can find lots. And it's tempting to begin to draw immediate connections between objects. I think I'm showing you on the left a manuscript illumination that's in the Getty Museum's collection, and which was recently featured in an exhibition dedicated to representations of Balthazar, who is the African king shown in both of these works. I think you can look at the general approach to depicting this scene, and you can't help, it seems to me, but see some shared resemblances. I don't think that that means that the illuminator of the manuscript on the left is responsible for the painting on the right. I wouldn't want to be misheard saying that. I think instead they probably share a certain set of concepts about how this scene should be produced, who needs to be present in order for it to count as an appropriate adoration scene, and they may be looking at a similar model. It seems to me that's maybe the likeliest of all. And so that question becomes, what is the model for the Timken's painting for this little picture from the Book of Hours? And there are some good thoughts about this. If you go back to a great painter of the mid 15th century like Roger van der Weyden, I'm showing you here his Columba altarpiece, which is at the Alte Pinakothek in Munich. You can see these now familiar characters, but with some differences. It's really in the mid-15th century that the identification of Balthasar as a African king sort of comes into sharp focus, and van der Weyden hasn't yet gotten there, at least not clearly there, and the landscape behind is much more fully developed, and van der Weyden is sort of hinting at his understanding of Renaissance perspective in this particular altarpiece. And certainly he's showing off his skills with painting with oil glazes, so much so that he inspires countless imitators, including the master of the Prado, Adorations, another unknown painter, and his retelling of that scene very closely along the lines that van der Weyden gives us in the image on the right. So I think anybody would look at these two paintings and agree, I hope, that they share a certain set of precepts, and even closer looking would say that the artist of the work on the right has probably looked at the painting on the left and used it as his chief model. Friedlander thought it might be a work by the Master of the St. Lucy legend, because that painter, more than knowing Roger van der Weyden, seemed to know the work of Hans Memling, who worked in Bruges and who did his own series of adorations of the Magi. And so Friedlander saw enough of a resemblance between Memling's approach, and I'm showing you two of those, and what we see in the Timken panel for him anyway, to suggest that they shared knowledge of one another. And presumably the painter of the Timken's panel knew paintings like these two that I'm showing you of Memling, one of which is today at the Prado in Madrid, and the other of which is in Bruges. And from that direct experience of Memling's work brings about this new work inspired by it, you could say. Going into the 16th century further, you see how refined this approach becomes. And here I'm showing you a work by Gérard David of the Adoration of the Kings, which lives in London. And I think it's part of a diptych, which I'm not showing you the other part, but then work inspired by David, probably by his workshop, also known as the Adoration of the Magi, which lives at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And I think you can begin to see, I hope anyway, by showing you the succession of images, you can begin to see how artists might take a look at what a great master like David does, and then bring those ideas to bear on their own works. I'm interested, for instance, the way that Melchior in this painting looks quite a bit like the image of Melchior in our painting. And then in the workshop image, the stance of Balthasar really resembles what we have going on in the Timken painting. And so you have to imagine these artists in a pre-internet era exposing themselves to as much as possible, and then taking those ideas from their exposure and putting them to bear in their new works. By the second quarter of the 16th century, the explosion really of these images is almost too much to keep track of. And so you have artists as different as Jan Gossart or Jürgen Tutzen-Jans or Jan Mostart, all taking their run at this depiction of the Adoration of the Magi, each bringing something slightly different, and it becoming a much more mannered work than what we see in the Timken's presentation of this scene. So I think 1525 begins to seem a little late for a painting like the Timkens, or if it were done in that era or later, it would be a kind of nostalgic looking piece, a piece that looked backwards rather than forwards towards these much more involved and I think challenging depictions of this scene. Notice how crowded it's become, and how the architecture, especially in the back of the Mostart, which is the latest picture I'm showing you here, really begins to become a main focus, which it's not. It's just simply not in the Timken's picture. This is just final proof of that sort of tendency towards more and more mannered approach to this particular setting and this particular scene. I'm showing you the Detroit Adoration of the Magi, which again seems even more complicated and in that way distinct from the relatively straightforward presentation that we have in the Timken picture. So I guess what I wanted to offer in this presentation, and I'm not a scholar of early Netherlandish painting, although I loved the courses that I took from James Merrow at UC Berkeley as an undergraduate on that material. I don't pretend to be an expert, but I spent quite a bit of time now trying to puzzle out where the closest connections might be found. And I think if you look at the Timken's painting on the left and look at a painting like the one by Jürgen Toots-St. from about the same time, this is a painting that happens to live in Prague, I think you can begin to feel that there are some real important correspondences between these two paintings. If you look at the just general contours of the landscape, the rough positions of the figures, the attitude of Mary, and the treatment of space, I think you can say that this artist is at least inhabiting the same worldview as the artist who we know, in this case, Toots-St. Does. And that helps us to understand where the Timken's picture fits into art history. I'm really struck as you look at close details of paintings like this anonymous master on the left and another anonymous master, in this case, the master of the St. Ursula legend, and you start to notice the things they share in common. For instance, the treatment of Mary as this red-headed, widow-peaked young woman with these sad, downturned eyes and this almost childlike face, and then the treatment of the baby in her arms. All those things start to resonate. And I'm showing, again, this is a detail of a painting that I saw recently at the Harvard University Art Museums in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And you start to say, yes, it feels like the Timken picture has something related to this picture going on. Different for sure. Looking at this particular comparison of details, I have to think that the Timken's painting has lost some of its glazing through overcleaning, or maybe it never had it to begin with. The other thing that looking at the Harvard painting made me realize is that the Timken painting almost certainly is separated from some larger network of imagery. So we know that the Harvard picture by the master of the St. Ursula legend has a brother at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and originally it was a diptych, a kind of two-paneled devotional object where the patron was on one side and the Mary and baby Jesus were on the other, and in prayerful moments, the owner would open it up and reflect on this close relationship between themselves and this divine image. And it seems to me that if we look at the Timken's painting and just its orientation, it was almost certainly part of a larger configuration of representations. I'm not saying it necessarily had a portrait of the donor next to it, but it could have had, for instance, the Nativity or the presentation at the temple or some other related iconography surrounding it. And so we're seeing something that's fragmentary rather than a whole. The other thing that close looking at this painting has made me realize lately is that there are a number of clues that haven't necessarily been seized upon by even our own research, and I'm eager to pursue these. I haven't done it for this presentation, but if you look closely, for instance, at the upper left-hand corner in this flag that I'm showing you in this detail here, there seems to be some sort of lettering. It could be later, and it could be just my imagination, but it also appears around the base of the cloak of the Balthazar figure. You also see this underpainting where the artist has changed the position of the feet, and that makes me think that this is a painting that would really benefit from a kind of X-ray analysis, and we would see a lot more of this kind of underdrawing, which only over time begins to surface in this way, were we to subject to some sort of infrared reflectography or other visual analysis. So I'm eager to pursue that. I'm not sure that that's going to lead us to clinching an identification for this painting, but it will help us understand what went on in its manufacture. And I think that's reason enough to get excited. I'm just showing you this painting because it hangs next to it in the Dutch Flemish galleries. And when you come back to the Timken, you should take a look at the Adoration of the Magi and this work in close proximity to one another, because this is a case where the painting in the center, this triptych we call it, showed this image of Mary of Sorrows, and only at a much later point were these two wings found and brought together, which sort of completes the image and lets us know much more about the context in which it was created. So this work, which is by Peter Claessens, the wings were sold at auction, I think in the Netherlands, within the last 15 years or so. And John Marchiori, now great colleague at the Morgan Library, was working in San Diego with me at the time, and was able to tell the owners of the Central Panel Prom and Sandy Dykstra that these two wings were coming up at auction and they were brought together. I'm not saying that we're going to have the same great good luck as the Dykstra did in reconstructing the whole image, but we might at some point find out that parts of this polyptych exist in other parts of the world, and it would be really fun to bring it together. That might actually help with the final identification of this heretofore unknown painter. So that's what I wanted to say this time. I hope to see you soon. I hope you're all feeling healthy and doing well. Take good care. Bye.